In the closing decades of the 19th century, in the avenues and squares of New York City, there existed a wealth so immense, so concentrated in so few hands, that it seemed permanent as the marble buildings that contained it. The Vanderbilt family, at the height of their fortune in the 1880s, possessed riches that exceeded the entire treasury of the United States. Their names adorned Fifth Avenue. Their grand houses rose like temples of commerce and ambition. And yet, within a single generation, a blink in historical time, nearly all of it had vanished. This is the story of how the world's greatest fortune was built, spent, and finally dissolved. It is a story told not in the abstract language of money, but in the rooms where it was spent, the balls where it was displayed, and the slow, inexorable process by which even the most Titan-like wealth can fade into memory. You will find here no lecturing, no moral finger-wagging about the follies of the rich. Instead, we invite you to step into the gaslit halls of Fifth Avenue, to walk the marble corridors of Newport's summer palaces, and to witness, as if you were there, the arc of a fortune that burned as brightly as a flame and left almost nothing behind. The machine that made this wealth was already in motion long before our story begins. But we enter this world in the 1870s, when the lights were still burning, when the fortune seemed not merely large but infinite, and when the very concept that such wealth could vanish had not yet occurred even to those who possessed it. The year is 1870. New York City is a city transformed and still transforming. The Civil War, only 5 years past, has receded into recent memory, leaving behind it the engines of a new industrial America. The railroads that helped tear the nation apart have now begun to stitch it back together, and in doing so they have created an entirely new class of wealth, a wealth that moves at the speed of steam and track, a wealth that is not inherited from the old merchant families of colonial New England, but built, aggressively built, in the span of a single lifetime. The wealthiest men of New York, and they are almost all men, do not live in the elegant Greek Revival homes of the 1830s. Those houses now seem quaint, even obsolete. Instead, the richest of the rich are building something new. They are building palaces. Structures so immense, so ornamented, so deliberately vast that they cannot be mistaken for anything but a statement of power and acquisition. On Fifth Avenue, what was once a street of respectable townhouses has begun its transformation into something else entirely. It is becoming a street of fortunes made visible. The transformation is happening so quickly that old New Yorkers look around in bewilderment. Where there was garden, there is now masonry. Where there was sky, there is now cornice and spire. The pace is almost dizzying, and yet to those living through it, it feels not frenzied, but inevitable, as if the accumulation of such wealth and its manifestation in stone and iron was not a choice but a law of nature, as certain as gravity. The architecture itself tells a story about the men who commission it. These are men who have conquered railroads, monopolized industries, and bent the very geography of America to their will. If they can build a transcontinental railroad through mountains and deserts, what is mere marble and granite and cast iron but another medium in which to express their dominion? And so the Fifth Avenue palaces grow, each one attempting to outdo the others, each one a competition not just in size, but in how much gold leaf can be applied, how many rooms can be filled, how many servants it will require to maintain. It is into this world of rapid wealth and rapid building, that we must now venture, because the fortune we will follow, the Vanderbilt fortune, is not merely a fortune. It is the fortune. It is the one against which all other New York wealth will be measured. The man who began it was named Cornelius Vanderbilt, though those who knew him at the height of his power called him the Commodore. He was born in 1794, the son of a ferry pilot in Staten Island. In those early years, there was nothing in his birth or circumstances to suggest that his name would one day be synonymous with the greatest private fortune in American history. But Cornelius Vanderbilt possessed something that no inheritance could buy, an unwavering belief in his own inevitable ascent. In the beginning, his fortune was made on water. At just 16 years old, on his birthday in May of 1810, the young Cornelius received a gift of $100, a substantial sum at the time. With that money, he purchased a small boat called the Swiftsure, a type of vessel known as a periauger, shallow-drafted and sturdy for the waters of New York Harbor. He began running a ferry service from his native Staten Island across to Manhattan, carrying passengers and goods from Stapleton on the island to the busy docks and markets of the city across the water. It was humble work, but it was his, and he was good at it. The waters of the harbor became intimate to him, as familiar as the paths of his own neighborhood. Steamboats were new then, a technology so recent that its implications had not yet been fully understood. When Vanderbilt was young, the Fulton-Livingston monopoly controlled much of the steamboat traffic, having been granted exclusive rights by the New York legislature. But in 1818, when Vanderbilt was a man in his 20s, working for a merchant named Thomas Gibbons, he saw an opportunity. Gibbons launched a steamboat service in direct competition with the monopoly, deliberately undercutting prices to challenge the established order. Where Fulton and Livingston charged their passengers $4 per journey, Vanderbilt and Gibbons charged just $1. He saw that steam meant speed, and speed and lower prices meant dominance. This rate war, this deliberate, calculated destruction of competing prices, would lead to one of the earliest great Supreme Court cases on American commerce, Gibbons v. Ogden, which ultimately shattered the monopoly. But Vanderbilt understood something beyond mere competition. He saw that true wealth came not from lower prices, but from consolidation. He built ferry routes. He took risks on new technology. And then, with astonishing speed, he consolidated. He bought out competitors. He drove prices down until rivals could not compete. And then, once dominance was secure, he raised prices. It was a pattern he would follow throughout his life. Enter a market, outcompete through ruthlessness and efficiency, achieve monopoly, extract wealth. By 1838, He had taken control of the Staten Island Ferry entirely, consolidating all water-based passenger transport on those routes into his own hand. As the decades passed and Vanderbilt moved into his 40s and 50s, steamships made him wealthy, but not supremely wealthy. The real fortunes, he began to understand, would be made on land, on the iron rails that were spreading across the continent like a vast network of commerce and power. By mid-century, Vanderbilt's attention turned entirely to the railroads. He was in his 50s when he began this new chapter. Again, he was not the first to see their potential, but he possessed an appetite for acquisition and consolidation that exceeded that of his rivals. He maneuvered himself into control of the New York Central Railroad, which connected New York City to the Great Lakes. Then he added other lines, the Harlem, the Hudson. He created a unified network stretching across New York State and beyond. By the time the Commodore reached his 70s, an age when most men were considering retirement, he was at the peak of his power. The railroad network of the eastern United States moved freight and passengers at his command. Locomotives bearing his company's names pulled millions of tons of cargo and hundreds of thousands of passengers every year. A fortune that had begun with ferries, with a 16-year-old boy and a single $100 gift, now encompassed the means of transportation for an entire region. What was remarkable about Vanderbilt was not merely his acquisitive genius, but his frugality. Even as he accumulated his vast fortune, he lived simply. He was known to work until late in life, maintaining personal control of his business empire. He did not lavish himself with luxuries as many wealthy men did. He did not spend on mansions or extensive travel. He saved, reinvested, and accumulated. He understood that wealth was not primarily a means of consumption, but a means of acquiring more wealth. And this discipline, this relentless focus on accumulation rather than display, set him apart from the men who would come after him. Men who inherited rather than earned, who spent rather than saved, who viewed vast fortunes as permission to live without constraint. The Commodore lived to be 82 years old. When he died on January 4, 1877, his estate was valued at approximately $105 million. To place this in context, the entire Federal Treasury of the United States at that moment held less. The fortune represented something close to 1/87th of the nation's entire gross domestic product. In modern terms, converted for inflation, this would place the Commodore's wealth somewhere in the region of $3 billion by 21st century calculation, though some estimates are considerably higher. But numbers alone cannot convey what it felt like to possess such wealth in that moment. It was not merely money, it was power. It was the power to reshape a city. It was the power to command entire industries. It was, in practical terms, almost unlimited. The Commodore left the bulk of his fortune to his eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt. And it was William Henry Vanderbilt, following in his father's footsteps but wielding even greater ruthlessness and cunning, who did something remarkable. He doubled the fortune. By the mid-1880s, the Vanderbilt family wealth exceeded $200 million. This was the richest family in the world, with more money than some nations. And this vast, gleaming, seemingly permanent accumulation of wealth existed now primarily for one purpose: not to build railroads, not to pioneer new commercial frontiers, but to be spent, to be displayed, to be housed in buildings of such magnificence that future generations would struggle to imagine how they came to exist. By the 1880s, Fifth Avenue, from the low 30s to the mid-80s, had become something unprecedented in American history. A quarter-mile-long concentration of the world's largest private fortunes, each one expressed in the form of a building. These were not office buildings. They were not boarding houses or tenements or any structure intended for practical commerce. They were houses, homes, built by single families for their exclusive use, typically occupied for only a few months of the year. Everything else was maintenance, preparation, waiting. To understand the social world of the 1880s is to understand that wealth alone did not confer status. Money was new, flowing in from industries that had barely existed a generation earlier. The railroad magnates, the oil men, the industrialists, these were not descended from the old Knickerbocker families that had ruled New York society from the colonial period through the early 19th century. There was a gatekeeper of old New York society, a woman named Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, known simply as Mrs. Astor. She was descended from ancient bloodlines, and she had determined that there were only 400 people in New York who were worth knowing. 400 and not one more, a number she had arrived at based simply on the capacity of her ballroom. This list, this reckoning of who was in and who was out, had become the most coveted status symbol in American society. To be on Mrs. Astor's 400 was to be acknowledged as belonging to the true elite, not merely the newly rich. The Vanderbilt family, with their fresh fortune and their ruthless ambition, chafed under this social dismissal. They had more money than the Astors, but they did not have time, and so they began to build. If they could not break into established society through bloodline, they would break in through architecture, through the sheer impossibility of ignoring them. To stand on Fifth Avenue in 1883 and look around was to witness an impossible profusion of architectural ambition. There was the Vanderbilt house at 660 Fifth Avenue, a French chateau designed by Richard Morris Hunt, modeled explicitly on aristocratic estates of the Loire Valley. There was another Vanderbilt mansion nearby at 1 West 57th Street, even larger and grander, and another, and another. The Astors had their palaces, but the Vanderbilts seemed most committed to the principle that a house should be indistinguishable from a palace, that domestic space should be indistinguishable from public monument. The competition between the families was relentless, quiet in its way, but understood by all observers to be a battle for supremacy. In 1883, the turning point came. Alva Vanderbilt, wife of William Kissam Vanderbilt, decided that she would no longer wait for Mrs. Astor's blessing. She would demand it through spectacle. On March 17, 1883, she threw a costume ball at the new mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue as a housewarming celebration. It was the most elaborate, most expensive, most talked-about social event New York had yet witnessed. Nearly 1,200 guests attended, each in an elaborate costume. The flower arrangements alone cost $11,000. The champagne was an additional $65,000. The costumes themselves had cost $156,000 combined. Gowns designed by the greatest couturiers of Paris, adorned with real gems, transformed into fabric sculptures. One guest wore a dress in the image of an electric light, fitted with a battery-powered torch. The Duke of Marlborough himself attended, dressed in a costume that had cost 5,000 francs, made entirely of velvet, silver embroidery, pearls and diamonds. The event was lit by thousands of gaslight fixtures, illuminating the marble walls, the gold details, the sea of perfectly coiffed society women and powerful men. It was a moment of pure, undeniable power. Mrs. Astor, who had held supreme social power for decades, was forced to acknowledge that the Vanderbilts had arrived. They could not be denied. Within days, the Vanderbilts were added to the 400. These buildings employed every device known to 19th century architecture to convey permanence, wealth, and an almost aggressive permanence. Marble, brought at enormous expense from European quarries, was deployed not as trim but as entire wall surfaces, entire room interiors. Ceilings were hand-painted by European masters brought from Paris and Rome, artists of renown who charged accordingly for the honor. Grand staircases swept upward through multiple stories, wrought iron railings catching light from gas sconces, leading to nowhere in particular, except that a grand staircase was what the very wealthy were meant to descend, slowly, visibly, to demonstrate their authority and control. The competition between the great families was not merely about size, but about architectural distinction. Richard Morris Hunt, the leading architect of his era, designed multiple mansions for the Vanderbilts, each innovative, each making a distinct statement. The architectural language of these houses changed from year to year as each family sought to distinguish itself. French Renaissance, Italian Renaissance, Gothic Revival, every historical style was borrowed from Europe and redeployed on Fifth Avenue as a marker of taste and expense. A single one of these palaces might contain 60 rooms, 70 rooms, 100 rooms. Many were never occupied. A family might live in New York for the winter social season, occupy the house for 2 or 3 months, and then depart for their actual summer residence in Newport, Rhode Island, leaving the palace essentially empty except for the full staff of servants required to maintain it. These servants numbered in the dozens: butlers, under-butlers, housemaids, chambermaids, laundry maids, cooks, sous chefs, footmen, porters, coachmen, stable hands. Some of the great houses kept a separate staff of 30, 40, even 50 people, all employed to maintain spaces that might be lived in for a few weeks a year. The dining arrangements for a grand dinner reflected the complexity of the enterprises. A single dinner service for 50 guests might span 6 or 7 hours, with multiple courses, each accompanied by specific wines from specific vineyards. The kitchen staff would spend all day in preparation, with sous chefs managing different stations, sauciers creating elaborate sauces, pastry chefs preparing elaborate desserts. The presentation of each course was choreographed like a ballet, footmen entering in unison, placing plates in synchronization, removing them together, the entire operation orchestrated to create an effect of effortless perfection, masking impossible labor. The expense of simply existing in such a house was staggering. Heating a building of 100 rooms in a New York winter required coal deliveries of such volume that the coal itself arrived by the ton, entire carts of it pulled by heavy horses to the delivery entrances, hidden from public view, keeping the marble polished, the silver gleaming, the carpets beaten, the electric lights, a relatively new luxury, functioning, the carriages maintained and the horses fed and groomed. It was an industrial operation, a small factory devoted not to producing anything, but to producing the appearance of perfect maintenance and perfect order. And yet for the families that occupied these palaces, the expense seemed almost insignificant. The wealth flowing in from railroads, from stock dividends, from real estate, from the compound interest on money that was already being multiplied by new money, seemed endless. To spend $10,000 on a ball was not considered extraordinary. To spend $100,000 on renovations or additions was merely prudent stewardship. The palaces grew not because they needed to, but because it was what was done, because it was expected, because in an age without income tax, without estate taxes, without any restraint on the accumulation and display of wealth, why should one not build the largest, most magnificent house that human labor and European stone could construct? But the Fifth Avenue palaces, grand as they were, occupied only a portion of the year. The true seat of Gilded Age power was not New York, but Newport, Rhode Island, a small town on an island some 2 hours from the city, where the very richest of the wealthy had established a summer colony unlike anything else in America. Newport in the 1880s and 1890s was not a place where one went to escape the world. Rather, it was where the entire social hierarchy of American wealth relocated for precisely 6 weeks each summer, taking all its rituals and competitions with it. The season was rigid in its timing. Families did not arrive early or stay late. They arrived in June or July, remained for the prescribed period, participated in the prescribed events, and then departed. The cottages would be closed, shuttered, left to their caretakers and maintenance staff. The summer colony was a temporary city, more choreographed and more relentless than anything that took place in New York. The houses built in Newport were called cottages, a term that reveals the depths of self-delusion among their builders. A cottage suggests modesty, a simple seaside retreat. The Newport cottages of the 1880s suggested no such thing. They were palaces, every one of them, built specifically to outdo each other. The competition here was not merely about size, but about the quality of the site. Which properties had the best ocean views, the most commanding positions overlooking Narragansett Bay? The Vanderbilt family alone maintained multiple properties, each more elaborate than the last. There was Rough Point, there was Clarendon Court, and then there were the two greatest, Marble House and the Breakers. Marble House was built by William Kissam Vanderbilt as a birthday gift for his wife, Alva. The gesture itself, a complete mansion as a birthday present, was a statement of power and affection that transcended normal expression. The mansion was completed in 1892. Its construction had consumed $11 million, an extraordinarily vast sum. Of this total, $7 million had been spent on 500,000 cubic feet of marble imported from European quarries. The house contained 50 rooms and required a full-time staff of 36 servants even when the family was absent. The entry portico, with its great columns, was deliberately modelled on the Petit Trianon at the Palace of Versailles, the small palace where the French royal family had enjoyed private leisure. The message was deliberate and unmistakable. If you are European royalty, you retreat to Versailles. If you are Vanderbilt, your summer cottage in America is built according to the same principles, or perhaps surpasses them. The interior of Marble House was designed for display. The gold ballroom, created by the Parisian decorators Allard and Sons, was sheathed entirely in gold leaf. Every surface gleamed. The walls were carved wood and gold panels depicting classical scenes from mythology. It was a room designed for evening events, for the display of jewels and fine clothes, for the gathering of the most important people of the season. The Chinese tea house, a separate structure on the grounds, was an exotic retreat decorated to evoke the Orient in a way that would never have been authentic, but was entirely beautiful by 19th century standards. The garden facades looked toward the ocean and cliff walk beyond, a sequence of spaces designed to reveal themselves gradually to guests. The Breakers was larger still, even more commanding. Built between 1893 and 1895 for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the mansion contained 70 rooms and encompassed an incredible 138,000 square feet of floor space. The cost of construction alone was estimated at $7 million. An additional $5 million was spent on furnishings, landscaping, and the acquisition of artwork from Europe, tapestries and paintings and sculptures brought from the Old Masters collection of European estates. The grounds surrounding the house had been purchased for $450,000. This was a fortune unto itself, enough money to live comfortably for generations, spent simply to acquire the land on which to place the house. The Breakers was built on the principle that a private residence should be not merely comfortable but imposing, that the external expression should communicate power to anyone who beheld it. No expense was spared on the materials. The structure itself was built of masonry and steel trusses with no wood, making it as fireproof as possible, a precaution that spoke to the anxiety of the era about fire in large buildings. Elaborate windows with sea views occupied multiple facades. Enormous kitchens occupied the basement level, capable of preparing elaborate meals for hundreds of guests. Servant quarters were as extensive as the family quarters, an entire hidden city existing to serve the visible city above, with separate staircases, separate corridors, an entire infrastructure devoted to the invisible labor that made the visible luxury possible. The daily life of Newport during the 6-week season followed a strict social choreography. Mornings were spent in leisure, sleeping late, taking breakfast in one's suite, reading the society pages to see who had been where. Afternoons saw lawn parties on the great grounds, women in white muslin dresses and enormous hats protecting themselves from the sun, men in light suits and straw boaters. The parties would begin in the warm, late afternoon and continue as evening approached, with champagne served from silver trays, strawberries and fresh fruits from local sources arranged on damask tablecloths. As dusk arrived and the sky over Narragansett Bay turned from pale blue to orange to deep purple, the guests would linger, reluctant to depart, until finally the light would fade and they would return to their cottages to dress for evening. The evenings were devoted to dinners, dances, card games, private entertainments, orchestras brought from New York to play in the ballrooms, famous singers imported to perform, champagne flowing without restraint. It was a machine designed to produce pleasure, luxury, and the constant affirmation that these families and their money were supreme. And yet, for all the magnificence of these structures, they were occupied briefly. The family would come to Newport in June or July, spend a few weeks or months, host parties and dinners, display their jewels and fine clothes, and then depart in late August or September to travel to Europe for the autumn or return to New York for the social season. The houses sat, for most of the year, essentially empty. The servants remained, maintaining, polishing, preparing, waiting for the 6 weeks when the season would return and the entire elaborate performance would begin again. To live in one of these great houses, for those who did not own it, was to live in a world organized with almost military precision. The servants who kept the mansions functioning existed in a parallel society, quite literally below the stairs, separated from the family quarters by locked doors and strict protocol. A housemaid, for instance, was never to be seen by the family unless in the performance of specific duties and in specific rooms. A butler might ascend to the family's private spaces, but only with explicit purpose. The organization of domestic service was so elaborate that an actual hierarchy existed. Upper servants and lower servants, with the butler at the top, then the housekeeper, then the cook, then various tiers of lower servants, whose work was considered less skilled or prestigious. The workday for these servants began before dawn and ended long after the family slept. A chambermaid might rise at 4 in the morning to begin the work of emptying chamber pots, lighting fires in bedrooms before the arrival of central heating and preparing the rooms for the day. The cook in the kitchen would begin work even earlier, preparing breakfast, then moving immediately to planning and preparing lunch, then dinner. The laundry maids worked in rooms filled with steam from the great copper boiling vats, their hands perpetually raw from hot water and bleach. Even in an era when an individual servant's wages might be $4 or $5 per week, a not insignificant sum for the time, the work was relentless, the hours were long, and the social degradation was absolute. And yet the servants in the great houses occupied a position of strange power. They knew the family's secrets. They observed the marriages, often loveless, that wealth had arranged but failed to make happy. They saw the indulgences, the waste, the casual cruelty that wealth encouraged. A servant who had been in a household for many years might know the master's affairs, their debts, their disappointments, their moral failures. The unwritten code between servant and employer was one of absolute discretion. Servants did not speak of what they had witnessed, even after leaving the household. But the knowledge was there, the witnessing was there, and it created a strange inversion in which those at the bottom, unseen, knew far more about the reality of the top than the top knew about itself. The meals prepared in those great kitchens were staggering in their complexity. A dinner party for 50 guests might begin with multiple courses: soup, fish, meat, salad, cheese, dessert. Each course would involve multiple dishes, multiple sauces, multiple opportunities for the kitchen to display its skill. The recipes would often be French, because French cooking was considered the standard of civilization. The provisions themselves would be expensive and exotic. Oysters from specific waters considered superior, beef from specific breeding lines, wines from specific vineyards in Bordeaux or Burgundy. All of this had to be prepared in kitchens that, by modern standards, were archaic. Coal-fired stoves, no refrigeration beyond ice boxes filled with ice delivered by ice carts, everything accomplished by hand. For the family above stairs, the meals simply appeared, perfect and abundant. For the servants below, Every meal was preceded by hours of labor, and after every meal came hours more of labor. Scrubbing pots, cleaning dishes, polishing silverware, storing away the fine linens that had been used. The physical plant of a great house required constant tending. Carpets must be beaten regularly, furniture polished, walls painted, gardens tended, horses groomed and fed. In an age without machines to replace this labor, no vacuum cleaners, no dishwashers, no automated cleaning systems, the great houses of the Gilded Age were human enterprises, consuming human energy at a scale that would now seem incomprehensible. Yet the servants themselves, viewing their positions from the perspective of lower middle-class life, often considered themselves fortunate. A position in a great household, while exhausting and demeaning, offered stability, regular meals, shelter, and the opportunity to save money. The kitchen servants in a wealthy household ate better than most working-class people could afford, and there was, for some, a strange comfort in the clarity of hierarchy, in knowing one's place, in the understanding that one's role, however humble, was essential to the functioning of this elaborate world. In the Gilded Age, wealth had become fluid enough that it could be exchanged for things it could not previously purchase. In particular, it could be exchanged for social position, which in 19th century Europe was still, at least technically, available only through aristocracy and centuries of bloodline. The system that emerged was simple and cynical. American heiresses, daughters of railroad magnates and industrial titans whose wealth was literally only one generation old, would marry European aristocrats whose titles were ancient but whose treasuries were depleted. The Americans received social position and the glamour of aristocracy. The Europeans received money, substantial, immediate, transformative money. The children that resulted would be born into wealth and title simultaneously, a combination that neither parent's line alone possessed. The phenomenon was vast in scope. Between 1870 and 1914, more than 450 American heiresses married into European noble families. Over 102 British aristocrats, including 6 dukes, took American brides. American heiresses married more than a third of the House of Lords. The dowries and settlements flowed like a river from America to Europe, estimated in aggregate at more than $4 billion in contemporary terms. This was not a rare occurrence or a scandal, but rather a systematic transfer of wealth on a scale that had seldom been seen. It was the commodification of titles, the selling of ancient prestige to finance contemporary needs. The mechanics were straightforward. A family would identify a suitable aristocratic family with financial difficulties. A marriage would be arranged. Negotiations would determine the size of the dowry. The wedding would be celebrated as a triumph of international relations, a union of continents, a marriage of old-world refinement with new-world wealth. The term given to these young women was dollar princesses, and they were not naive victims stumbling into these arrangements. Many were fully aware of the transaction, but in an era when a young woman of good family had very few options for self-determination, she could marry or remain a dependent, typically under the control of her father or brother. The opportunity to marry a duke, even a poor duke, was considered an excellent outcome. The titles of Europe's declining aristocracies became, effectively, a commodity for purchase by American wealth, and the daughters of the American wealthy became the currency through which these purchases were made. One famous example was Jenny Jerome, daughter of a railroad speculator, who married Lord Randolph Churchill and became the mother of Winston Churchill. Another was Mary Leiter, daughter of a Chicago merchant who married George Curzon, who became Viceroy of India. These women entered European society, bore children who were heirs to both American fortunes and British titles, and became gatekeepers themselves. Proof that American money could indeed purchase entrance into the most exclusive circles. The most famous of these dollar princesses was Consuelo Vanderbilt, daughter of William Kissam Vanderbilt, and the great-granddaughter of the Commodore. Consuelo's mother, Alva, was a formidable woman with ambitions for her daughter that exceeded even the typical expectations of her era. She had orchestrated the 1883 ball that had broken the Astor monopoly. She had built her social position through sheer force of will and expenditure. Now she turned her attention to arranging a marriage that would transcend even the achievements of that ball. In 1895, at age 18, Consuelo was married to Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. The Duke was handsome, titled, English, and desperate. Blenheim Palace, his ancestral seat in Oxfordshire, was crumbling under the weight of neglect, decay, and his family's inability to afford its maintenance. The marriage was arranged by Alva with the precision of a military campaign. The match would solve the Duke's financial crisis. It would give Consuelo an ancient title. It would be celebrated on both sides of the Atlantic as a triumph of American wealth and old-world gentility. The marriage took place on November 6, 1895, at St. Thomas Church in Manhattan, attended by hundreds of the most prominent people of New York society. Consuelo was dressed in white satin and lace, a veil of Brussels lace falling from a tiara of diamonds and pearls. It was said that she wept behind the veil during the ceremony. The wedding was celebrated in the newspapers as a triumph of both nations, the unification of American dynamism and English tradition. But the marriage itself was a horror from its inception. On the honeymoon, traveling through Europe en route to Blenheim, the Duke informed Consuelo that he had married her not for love, but because he felt obliged to save his ancestral estate from financial ruin. He had needed, quite simply, money. His estate was bankrupt. His family name required capital to continue. She was the instrument through which that capital would flow. The dowry that accompanied Consuelo to England was $2.5 million in railroad stock, equivalent to perhaps $60 or $70 million in contemporary terms. The money flowed into Blenheim. Stone by stone, the ancient palace was restored. Roofs were repaired, gardens were replanted. The ancient estate was preserved through the mechanism of American industrial wealth and the marriage market. Consuelo and Charles Spencer Churchill lived together long enough to produce 2 sons. The Marquess of Blandford was born in 1897 and Lord Eva in 1898, but they never lived as husband and wife in any meaningful sense. She had fulfilled her function to produce heirs and to finance a name. By the first years of the 20th century, they were living apart. The Duchess spent her time in England and France enduring her position, maintaining appearances, raising her sons to understand that they were special, that they belonged to an inheritance that transcended nationality and class. She grew older in her exile, her youth gradually consumed by the years. In 1906, the couple moved to an official separation. In 1921, after 26 years, they divorced. In 1926, the marriage was annulled by the Catholic Church. Years later, Consuelo would write her memoirs, titled The Glitter and the Gold, in which she would describe her marriage with remarkable candor, acknowledging that it had been an arrangement of convenience and that she had been, in effect, sold into a foreign aristocracy to finance her family's social ambitions. She married again to a French engineer named Louis-Jacques Balsan, a marriage of genuine affection that she would describe as far happier than the first, though it received none of the social fanfare. Consuelo's experience was not unique. Across the period from the 1880s into the early 1900s, dozens and then hundreds of American heiresses married European aristocrats. The transactions were staggering. The Astor daughters married Englishmen and received peerages. Girls from the Gould family married counts and princes. The mining wealth of America, the railroad wealth, the industrial wealth that the Gilded Age had created flowed steadily overseas, propping up European estates and sustaining aristocratic lines that would otherwise have been forced to dissolve into modern economic reality. It was, in effect, a liquidation of American wealth in exchange for European social position, a trade that seemed in a moment tremendously advantageous. For the young women involved, it was often a profound tragedy, though one conducted in marble halls and attended by numerous servants. They had purchased positions in aristocracy with the only currency they possessed, themselves and the money that came with them. They had, in many cases, marriages that were arrangements in the most literal sense. They bore sons to continue family lines that were not their own. They endured infidelities, indifference, and a kind of emotional abandonment that was masked by luxury. And then they aged in their positions, supported by the money their fathers had made in America, which continued to flow even after marriage to sustain their positions in Europe. Consuelo's experience was not unique. Across the period from the 1880s into the early 1900s, dozens and then hundreds of American heiresses married European aristocrats. The transactions were staggering. The Astor daughters married Englishmen and received peerages. Girls from the Gould family married counts and princes. The mining wealth of America, the railroad wealth, the industrial wealth that the Gilded Age had created flowed steadily overseas, propping up European estates and sustaining aristocratic lines that would otherwise have been forced to dissolve into modern economic reality. It was, in effect, a liquidation of American wealth in exchange for European social position, a trade that seemed, in the moment, tremendously advantageous. For the young women involved, it was often a profound tragedy, though one conducted in marble halls and attended by numerous servants. They had purchased positions in aristocracy with the only currency they possessed, themselves and the money that came with them. They had, in many cases, marriages that were arrangements in the most literal sense. They bore sons to continue family lines that were not their own. They endured infidelities, indifference, and a kind of emotional abandonment that was masked by luxury. And then they aged, in their positions, supported by the money their fathers had made in America, which continued to flow even after marriage to sustain their positions in Europe. In the spring of 1893, as the season was beginning to warm in New York, and the wealthy were beginning to contemplate their journey to Newport, something happened that no one alive in the city had witnessed before. The elaborate financial structures that had been constructed over the previous decades suddenly revealed themselves to be less solid than they had seemed. The roots of the panic had been growing for some time, invisible to the wealthy, who were spending as lavishly as ever, but visible to those who understood the mechanics of credit and speculation. Throughout the 1880s, American railroads had been built at a pace that exceeded demand. Every investor wanted to own railroad stock, believing that the transcontinental routes would produce infinite wealth. But there were only so many routes to be built, only so much cargo to be transported. The railroads had been overbuilt. The companies had taken on enormous debt to finance construction, and by 1893 it became clear that this expansion could not continue indefinitely. The Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, long considered one of the most solid investments in America, collapsed into bankruptcy in February. The company could not pay its debts. The stock, held by thousands of investors, large and small, became worthless. Underlying the railroad crisis was a more fundamental problem: the currency itself. America was trying to maintain what was called bimetallism, the use of both gold and silver as the foundation for the currency. The government, under the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, had been required to purchase silver at inflated prices in an attempt to support the mining industry. But this had depleted the nation's gold reserves. Investors, fearing that America would abandon the gold standard and adopt a weaker silver standard, began to trade their American holdings for gold, draining the treasury further. This fear was rational, based on economic fundamentals. A country that runs out of gold reserves cannot maintain confidence in its currency. The mechanism was technical, but the result was visceral: panic, spreading like fire through the financial system. The panic began on May 3, 1893, when a massive sell-off of stocks sent share prices tumbling across the board. Investors who had assumed that their holdings could only increase in value, who had built fortunes partly on speculation and partly on the assumption that America's industrial growth would never cease, suddenly began to doubt. They began to sell, and as they sold, prices fell further, and as prices fell, panic increased. Within days, the National Cottage Company, a stock market favorite considered a near monopoly on American rope manufacturing, collapsed into receivership. The following day, the market crashed with even greater violence. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 24% in a single day. By the end of May, the panic that would later be named the Panic of 1893 was fully underway. Banks began to fail. By the end of that year, 642 banks had collapsed. In thousands of small towns across America, people lined up outside their banks on May mornings, withdrawing their savings while there was still money to withdraw. In barbershops and general stores, men spoke in low voices about bank runs. The banks had invested deposits in the stock market and in railroad stocks. When those values collapsed, the bank's reserves simply evaporated. By the afternoon, the bank doors would close. The money people had saved would be gone. In the process, the savings of hundreds of thousands of ordinary people, the working and middle classes who had scrimped to save something for retirement or hardship, were simply erased. The money was gone. There was no insurance. There was no government protection. There was no mechanism through which ordinary people could recover their losses. The money had been there, and then it was not. Many would not recover financially for the rest of their lives. 16,000 businesses failed in the wake of the panic. Factory owners could not secure credit to buy materials. They could not pay their workers. Mills closed. Construction stopped. Unemployment, which had been a manageable statistic, suddenly became a social crisis. By some estimates, national unemployment reached 20% in the first year following the crash. In some cities it was higher. Men who had been employed at steady wages suddenly had no income. They returned home to tell their wives and children that the job was gone. In cities and towns, lines formed outside soup kitchens and charitable organizations. The scale of suffering was immense. The economic depression that followed the panic would last for 4 years, until 1897, a depression so severe that it would alter the political landscape of the nation and spark labor unrest that would haunt the coming century. Populist movements rose, demanding that something be done. Strikes broke out among railroad workers and miners. The social cohesion of the nation seemed threatened. But for those at the very top, for the Vanderbilts and Astors and Goulds, the panic and depression were almost irrelevant. Their fortunes were large enough that they were invested across multiple sectors, multiple industries. A general collapse in stock prices might reduce wealth, but only by a percentage. The very richest could afford to hold their investments steady, to weather the storm, to wait for prices to recover. And indeed, for those who had the resources to buy while others were forced to sell, the panic could be an opportunity. The chance to acquire companies or assets at depressed prices, increasing one's holdings while others were being wiped out. More importantly, the great fortunes were now embedded in structures, the railroads, the trusts, the real estate holdings that were large enough to have actual social utility independent of the stock market. A railroad still moved trains that carried freight and passengers that were needed. An oil refinery still produced oil that the country required. These enterprises might suffer, might reduce their dividends, but they continued to function and continued to generate wealth. The Vanderbilt railroads, despite the depression, continued to transport cargo and passengers. The revenues came down but did not disappear. It was the small investors, the middle-class speculators, the ordinary people who had invested their life savings in hopes of becoming rich, who were destroyed. The very rich simply endured, diminished, but intact. Yet the panic of 1893 was nonetheless a signal. It suggested that the economic order that had seemed so permanent, so natural, might not be as stable as everyone had believed. It suggested that fortunes could fluctuate. It suggested, however distantly and however faintly, that perhaps permanence was not guaranteed, that perhaps even great wealth could be vulnerable to the vagaries of economic cycles. But in the palaces of Fifth Avenue and Newport, these lessons were not internalized. The wealth came back. By 1897, prices recovered. The flow of money into the great houses resumed. The young heirs who had watched the panic from a distance returned to their entertainments, and the building and spending and display continued, undeterred and unfatigued, as though the crisis had been merely a temporary disturbance, a hiccup in an otherwise inevitable upward trajectory of wealth and power. Yet the panic of 1893 was nonetheless a signal. It suggested that the economic order that had seemed so permanent, so natural, might not be as stable as everyone had believed. It suggested that fortunes could fluctuate. It suggested, however distantly and however faintly, that perhaps permanence was not guaranteed, that perhaps even great wealth could be vulnerable to the vagaries of economic cycles. But in the palaces of Fifth Avenue and Newport, These lessons were not internalized. The wealth came back. By 1897, prices recovered. The flow of money into the great houses resumed. The young heirs who had watched the panic from a distance returned to their entertainments. And the building and spending and display continued, undeterred and unfatigued, as though the crisis had been merely a temporary disturbance, a hiccup in an otherwise inevitable upward trajectory of wealth and power. To spend a fortune on the scale of the Vanderbilt family wealth in the 1880s and 1890s was an art form, and it was pursued with great dedication and creativity. The problem facing any member of the Vanderbilt family, particularly the younger generation, was not how to acquire money. Money came whether you did anything or not, flowing in from dividends and investments and the compound interest on money already accumulated. The problem was how to spend it, and to spend it in a manner that was both visible and tasteful, impressive and proportionate to one's station. In the matter of fashion, the standards of display were exacting. A woman of wealth did not wear the same gown twice to any public event. The gown would be designed specifically for that occasion, by European designers if possible, and it would be worn once and then set aside. The cost of a single evening gown could be several $100s, in an era when an ordinary working man might earn $1,000 per year. To have 30 such gowns, or 50, or 100, was not considered excessive for a woman of standing. The wardrobe of a wealthy woman was, in practical terms, a business unto itself, requiring seamstresses, designers, merchants, and numerous other specialists. Jewelries was equally important. The great jewelers of Europe and America created pieces specifically for the wealthy, using gems that had been mined under terrible conditions by ordinary people, cut and polished into shapes that fit an aesthetic standard that the wealthy had defined. A woman of standing wore diamonds, rubies, sapphires, emeralds, not costume jewelry, but the real thing, in quantities that would now seem incomprehensible. A single tiara might contain stones whose value exceeded the annual income of 100 ordinary people. A brooch might be worth a house, and these items were worn to dinners, to balls, to charity events, displayed not just for their monetary value, but as an assertion of standing. Travel was another medium of expensive consumption. The wealthy did not merely visit Europe, they lived there for months at a time, taking suites in the finest hotels, traveling by private rail car, moving from one resort or capital city to another. They traveled with trunks of clothing, with servants, with companions. The logistics of such travel were complex and expensive. A journey from New York to London in the 1880s required a week or more at sea, aboard a ship. The wealthy did not travel by ordinary steerage, but in first-class cabins, in suites that occupied significant portions of the ship. The cost of such travel was substantial and continuous. The decoration and redecoration of houses provided another endless channel for expenditure. To furnish and refurnish the palaces of Fifth Avenue and Newport was a task that was never completed. In an era when taste was considered a reliable guide to quality, the purchase of artwork, of antique furniture, of tapestries and sculptures and objects of every sort considered tasteful became an important pursuit. The wealthy competed not just in the size of their houses, but in the quality of their collections. To own a painting by an old master was not merely an aesthetic achievement, but a social one. The acquisition of art became one of the great mechanisms through which Gilded Age wealth was consumed. And yet, underlying all of this conspicuous consumption was a new form of consumption that had emerged with wealth at this scale, the consumption of spectacle itself. The Vanderbilt Ball of 1883, hosted by Alva Vanderbilt as the housewarming party for the mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue, cost $250,000. The guest list included nearly 1,200 people, all dressed in elaborate costumes. The flowers alone cost $11,000. The champagne, the catering, the music cost an additional $65,000. For a single evening, one evening, a fortune equivalent to that which might support a family for a lifetime was expended. The ball was not required for survival or even for comfort. It was required only to assert dominance, to demonstrate the limitless nature of available wealth, to make a statement that no other family could afford to make. And yet even this was not considered excessive. This was rather exactly what was expected. The wealthy were supposed to spend extravagantly. The very wealthy were supposed to spend impossibly extravagantly. The lavishness was not a symptom of excess, but a fulfillment of duty. To be rich was to display your wealth, to make it visible, to use it as a medium through which to assert your social position. In an age without significant taxation, without significant regulation, without any mechanism through which society could constrain conspicuous consumption, the wealthy spent because spending was what the wealthy did, and the larger the fortune, the larger the spending was supposed to be. In 1877, when Cornelius Vanderbilt the Commodore died, he left behind an estate valued at approximately $105 million. The estate was divided among his heirs according to his will. The bulk of it went to his eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt, while smaller portions went to his daughters and other children. His widow, Frank Crawford Vanderbilt, received a portion sufficient to maintain her for the remainder of her life. The process by which the Commodore's wealth was transferred to his heirs was, in that moment, relatively straightforward. There was no federal income tax. The 16th Amendment had not yet been ratified and would not be until 1913. There was no estate tax, no inheritance tax, no mechanism by which the government could claim a portion of a deceased person's wealth. The heirs received essentially the full value of what had been bequeathed to them. The money passed intact from generation to generation, every dollar that the Commodore had accumulated available to be spent or reinvested. This absence of taxation had profound consequences. It meant that the mechanisms through which wealth could be consolidated and concentrated across generations were essentially unlimited. A man could accumulate a fortune in his lifetime, and at his death, that fortune could pass intact to his heirs, multiplied by the compound interest that had accumulated during his ownership. And then those heirs could hold that wealth, accumulate even more, and pass it on again to the next generation. again intact and again multiplied. It was a process that, left unchecked, would lead to a concentration of wealth at a level that the world had seldom seen. It was also a system that would not survive the century. But William Henry Vanderbilt did not simply sit on his inheritance and watch it grow. Instead, he did what the Commodore had done. He actively managed the wealth. He bought more railroads. He made investments. He negotiated mergers and consolidations. And remarkably, he was successful at it. By the time William Henry Vanderbilt died in 1885, his fortune had actually been doubled. The Vanderbilt family wealth, which had been approximately $105 million in 1877, was now some $200 million or more. It was the largest single fortune on the North American continent and one of the largest in the world. For a moment, it seemed as though the dynasty would continue to grow, to compound, to become even larger, that the Vanderbilt name would be synonymous with wealth for centuries to come. But a problem emerged that would prove to be more difficult than Cornelius Vanderbilt or William Henry Vanderbilt could have anticipated. It was far easier to build a fortune than to divide it among multiple heirs without diminishing it. When William Henry Vanderbilt died in 1885, his will divided the wealth among his 8 children. The fortune that had been consolidated in his hands was now split into portions, each portion large, millions of dollars each, but no longer unified under a single manager's direction. The mechanism that had created the wealth, the vision, the ruthlessness, the careful management of Cornelius and William Henry could not be inherited. It could only be learned, and learning it required circumstances that no son or daughter of extreme wealth ever faced. More importantly, the heirs of the second generation had not earned the money. They had not struggled to accumulate it. They had not developed the discipline or the focus that the Commodore and William Henry had brought to wealth management. Instead, they had grown up in luxury, accustomed to spending, trained by their entire environment in the principle that wealth was a means to consumption rather than a tool to be managed and expanded. The palaces they lived in, the servants, the endless fountains of money, all of this was simply the natural state of the world to them. Many could not imagine that it might ever be otherwise. As the generations moved forward, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the pattern became increasingly clear. Wealth, without active management by someone focused on expansion and consolidation, tends to contract. Expenses mount relentlessly. Taxes, once they were finally implemented, take a portion of every generation's wealth. Between 1913 and 1916, the federal government implemented the income tax and then the estate tax, mechanisms that would have been unimaginable in the Commodore's era. The Revenue Act of 1913 imposed a federal income tax on all Americans earning above a certain threshold. The Revenue Act of 1916 went further, imposing a federal estate tax on all property transferred at death. The rates began modestly but rose during wartime. By the 1920s, the highest estate tax rates approached 50% or more. The houses must be maintained, the servants must be paid, the estates must be managed. What had been passed intact to one generation could only be passed diminished to the next. Slowly, steadily, the great fortunes began to decline. By the 1920s, the great mansions that had been built during the Gilded Age began to disappear. In 1926, the Cornelius Vanderbilt second mansion at 1 West 57th Street, the largest private residence ever constructed in New York City, was demolished to make room for the Bergdorf Goodman building. Before the wrecking ball came, the widow, Alice, arranged for the mansion to be open to the public at 50 cents per person, with the proceeds going to charity. Within days, it was gone. In 1927, the William K. Vanderbilt mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue, the site of the famous 1883 ball, was demolished. The architectural jewel, the Petit Chateau, that had taken pride of place on Fifth Avenue, was replaced with a commercial office building for a fashion retailer. The great mansions that had seemed permanent, monuments to eternal wealth, simply ceased to exist. Their constituent parts were scattered. A fireplace went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Gates went to Central Park. Sculptural reliefs ended up in hotel lobbies. The buildings themselves vanished. Some of the Vanderbilt heirs attempted to manage the wealth actively. Some invested in business ventures that failed. Some simply did not understand the value of what they had been given. And many did what the Gilded Age had taught them to do. They spent. They spent on houses, on art, on jewelry, on travel, on the endless parade of consumption that wealth made possible. They spent as though the money would never run out, and for their entire lifetimes they were proven right. There was always more money. But for their children and their grandchildren, there would eventually come a reckoning. By the middle of the 20th century, heirs began selling the great Newport mansions they could no longer afford to heat. Marble House was donated to the Preservation Society in 1944. The breakers eventually came under institutional stewardship. The Fifth Avenue palaces were replaced by office buildings and hotels. The wealth that had seemed so permanent, so overwhelming, so infinite in its abundance, had simply run out. By 1973, nearly 100 years after the Commodore's death in 1877, the great fortune had been so thoroughly dispersed and consumed that it had essentially ceased to exist. 120 members of the Vanderbilt family gathered that year for a reunion. Among those 120 people descended from the richest man in America, connected by blood and name to the greatest fortune that their nation had produced. There were no millionaires, not one. The money had vanished. How does such a thing happen? How does a fortune built painfully over decades, multiplied across generations, displayed in marble and gold and precious stones, simply disappear? The answer is not dramatic. There is no single villain, no catastrophic loss, no moment of terrible decision. Instead, there are 1,000 small decisions, each one reasonable in isolation, each one the product of the world in which they were made. First, there was consumption. The great houses, magnificent as they were, required endless maintenance and expense. The staff that kept them functioning cost money every single day. The heating, lighting, and utilities cost money. The repairs and restorations cost money. To maintain even a single Vanderbilt mansion as originally furnished would cost several $1 million per year in contemporary money. Multiply that by the number of houses in New York, Newport, Paris, other cities, and the total annual expense became staggering. Then there were taxes. By the early 20th century, the United States had finally implemented an income tax. By the 1920s, there were estate taxes, inheritance taxes, gift taxes, a complex apparatus through which the government claimed a portion of every fortune when it changed hands. A son might inherit $10 million, but by the time federal and state taxes were assessed, he might only actually receive $6 or $7 million. Upon his death, the same process happened again. The next generation received only a fraction of what the previous generation had held. More subtly, there was the problem of management. The Commodore had managed his wealth actively, buying and selling, trading and consolidating, always focused on expansion. William Henry Vanderbilt had done the same, but their descendants, born into wealth, educated in Europe, trained in leisure rather than business, often lacked either the inclination or the skill to actively manage the fortune. Money that was simply held, not invested strategically, slowly lost value. Investments that were made poorly reduced the principal. Over decades, compound decline is as powerful as compound interest. And perhaps most importantly, there was the simple problem of human nature. People who are born into wealth often do not understand its value. They see money as something that appears automatically, sufficient to support any lifestyle. They do not understand scarcity, they do not understand the concept of limited resources, and so they spend, not maliciously, but casually, in ways that would horrify someone who had built wealth from nothing, who understood each dollar as something earned and protected. And perhaps most importantly, there was the simple problem of human nature. People who are born into wealth often do not understand its value. They see money as something that appears automatically, sufficient to support any lifestyle. They do not understand scarcity. They do not understand the concept of limited resources, and so they spend, not maliciously, but casually, in ways that would horrify someone who had built wealth from nothing, who understood each dollar as something earned and protected. By the middle of the 20th century, the great houses had begun to pass out of private hands. Marble House in Newport was donated to the Preservation Society in 1944. The breakers followed, eventually coming under institutional stewardship. The Fifth Avenue palaces were demolished, one by one, as the area changed and taxes made private ownership impractical. The grand houses that had been constructed as permanent expressions of permanent wealth simply ceased to exist as private residences. They became museums, monuments to a world that was passing away. But they remain. Some of them persists, open to the public, filled with tourists who pass through rooms lit now by electric light, who look at the grandeur and try to comprehend what it meant to live in such a place, to possess such wealth, to have such power. The portraits on the walls remain. The Commodore in his formal dress, William Henry Vanderbilt with his characteristic severity, Alva Vanderbilt at the peak of her social power. The furniture remains, the carpets, the tapestries, the paintings. The physical evidence persists. And so we come to the end of this story. Or perhaps not the end, but the long, slow diminishment that followed the peak, the fade into background noise, and then into silence. The Vanderbilt name persists. The great-great-great-grandchildren of Cornelius Vanderbilt still exist, still carry the name, still perhaps carry some residual pride or shadow of the family's history. But the fortune is gone. The money that seemed so permanent, so overwhelming in its totality, proved to be as fragile and fleeting as the greatest human works always are. The great fortunes of the Gilded Age were built on a foundation of industrial innovation, of ruthlessness, of a particular moment in history when the exploitation of resources and labor could proceed without regulation or restraint. Those fortunes were displayed in marble and gold, in summer palaces and winter estates, in the lives of thousands of servants and the marriages of daughters into European aristocracy. They seemed, in their moment, to represent something permanent, something eternal, a new form of power that would last forever. And yet they did not last. The money came and went like a tide. The buildings that house it now are museums. The family that owned it is now, like any other family, searching for meaning and purpose in an ordinary world. The fortune that once seemed to elevate above all ordinary constraint has demonstrated, as all things must, the universal law of impermanence. What was built was taken apart. What was gathered was scattered. What seemed unbreakable was broken. But in the silent halls of the great mansions, in the afternoon light falling through windows that have not been opened in decades, the memory of that wealth remains. It remains in the carved marble, in the gilded details, in the scale and grandeur of spaces designed to impress. It remains in the photographs and the historical records. And it remains, finally, in the story we have just told. The story of a fortune that was vast and mighty, that seemed permanent and infinite, and that finally, like all fortunes in this world, passed away.